This is Olivia Green interviewing Congressman Kweisi Mfume for the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. It is currently 1:13 p.m. on February 12th, 2026, and this interview is being recorded in the Rayburn Building in Washington, D.C. And before I get into the questions, Congressman, can you please just state your full name, your title, and your relationship to WEAA for the record?
The name is Kweisi Mfume. I'm a member of the United States Congress from Maryland's 7th Congressional District, a graduate of Morgan State University, a former professor there, and founder of WEAA. We came on the air January 10th, 1977 at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and I threw the switch, and it's been on ever since.
Thank you so much. Can you please tell me when and where you were born?
I was born in Baltimore, Maryland, October 24th, 1948, at what was then known as City Hospital.
And I want to hear you describe kind of the Baltimore that you grew up in. So if you could imagine we're in the movie of your life, the biopic, what would the opening scene look like with a young Kweisi?
Well, the first thing is that it would be a segregated scene no matter where it was. My generation is the last current generation to grow up under legal segregation and Jim Crow. So no matter where you start the movie, it looks a little different from the way things look today because communities were very, very segregated then. But, I grew up like most other kids, happy to get up each day and happy to go outside and play when I wasn't in school. Played a lot of baseball, a lot of football, did a lot of fishing in those days in the community, and attended a segregated elementary school. It was Fleming Elementary. And then there was a middle school before you got to high school, which was called Bragg, and that was also segregated. And by the time I got to Solace Point Junior, Senior High School, it was still a segregated school. So we were bused by a couple of all-white schools to get to the black school, which is much further away. You didn't think about that as a kid. You just enjoyed the ride. Everybody had a good time. We liked to tease the driver of the bus, and he liked to tease us. And, it was a much more normal world. I didn't know that there was anything different because that's all I ever saw was segregated schools. So that's how your biopic would probably open up.
Thank you. And can you tell me a little bit about the people that raised you?
Well, actually, it was a community that raised me. My mother takes first prize because she was the first person that ever gave me a lesson, ever gave me her love, ever disciplined me, ever tried to tell me about values and why they were important. But it was a community, a very segregated community called Turner Station. It sits at the water's edge. It's right outside of Baltimore City proper. It is, and was, then at least I should say, it was a segregated community that was designed specifically to be a segregated community. So the black labor that worked at the Sparrows Point steel mills would be living close enough so that they could get to work every day. And that community stayed segregated like that for a very long time. Those steel mills are no longer there. But it was that larger community of people in the neighborhood that kind of raised everybody else. And that would be true for all the other kids there. You had your family, your parents, but technically everybody was your parent. If they wanted you to do something, or if they corrected you, or if they were not doing something right. And when it came to expressing and giving their love to kids in the neighborhood, they treated you as if you were a member of their family. So it was a tight-knit community. I think more than anything else, there was a camaraderie among the black residents there. We had 2 doctors, 2 dentists, at least 24 school teachers. Everybody lived within close proximity of each other. And I think more than anything else, because of that, there was absolutely no crime in the community whatsoever. But there was a general sense among everybody there that every child deserved the ability to get an education and to do better than their parents and their parents before them. So it was a good community to grow up in.
Yeah. How do you remember people talking about kind of the public affairs issues and political issues that the community was facing while you were a child?
Well, the grown-ups did that. They did that at night, and in the summertime, they would do it sitting around a great big steel bin with holes that were punched in its side, and they would burn wood, and people would sit in a circle around the wood. The wood would fend off, I didn't notice until much later in life, fend off the mosquitoes, which were everywhere because, we were right near the water. And it was an opportunity for them to laugh and talk or to listen to the radio. In fact, I heard radio boxing fights from my bedroom that they would have on in their little, I don't want to call it a little circle, it was a big circle. It may have been about 6 or 7 families gathered there. But they would talk about what was going on and what was not going on. And I think the first thing I ever really remembered was discussions about people taking a bus rather than sitting on the back of a bus, or walking rather than sitting on the back of a bus, which I really didn't understand. I mean, I later came to know it was the Montgomery bus boycott, and that word had gotten further up north to Baltimore and to other segregated communities. The Afro-American newspaper was the best source for news in those days. It's the oldest continuous family-owned black publication in the country. And that's where a great deal of information got transmitted. So my assumption is that the adults, the grown-ups, read that religiously, as I know they did. But my assumption is that it would be at moments like that, sitting outside together right after sunset in the community, talking about what they read or what they had heard. And that's the first thing I think I ever remembered hearing about any kind of social matter, that there were people somewhere that were walking every day to where they had to go because they didn't want to ride the bus, which didn't make a lot of sense to me as a kid. But, I later, as I said, understood what was going on. I would listen to fights, the Joe Louis fights, which were kind of legendary at the time because Joe Louis, who was known as the Brown Bomber, was the equivalent of what Muhammad Ali later became a couple of generations later. I mean, he was just the champ. Nobody could outbox him. And I think a guy named Max Schmeling, who was German or maybe Russian, was the big challenge to him. And for weeks and months leading up to the fight, that was a big discussion. So those were some of the things I recall. Other times I would remember old men in the community in the daytime sitting under pine trees, because there were a lot of pine trees there, and finding some shade to play checkers. And as they did that, they would talk about what was going on. I hung around there as much as I could because I wanted to run errands. And so you'd run this errand for that one and this one for another one. They'd give you a dime or something like that. But it always was curious to me about, they just seemed to know everything. They had an opinion about everything, let me say that. So anything that I got in terms of social affairs or events, it was just kind of being up against and around people who were affected by what was going on and who was free to talk about it. Some of the times that would happen when I'd be in the barbershop as a kid. And I enjoyed that because I liked to listen to what was going on. Those were the all male discussions. And not that it was anything so very different from a discussion might have been co-ed, except that they cursed a little more. And, they cursed a lot more when they wanted to, when they were trying to make a point. But they did it kind of lovingly toward each other and, arguing what they believed in and who was right and who was wrong and why I know more than you and you just can't be right about that. Those are my earliest recollections.
Yeah. And because we're here to talk about radio, I have to ask, what kind of music were you listening to as a young person?
I listened to what my family listened to, which was basically early jazz and early R&B. And when I say early jazz, I mean the jazz that came before what's known today as smooth jazz. And the people who were the songstress at the time were people like Ray Charles, Sarah Vaughan, Billie Holiday, Dizzy Gillespie. And then that kind of rolled into what was the early R&B of the day. And the early R&B groups like the Shirelles and the Marvelettes, and I guess Stevie Wonder was right at the edge of that. That was around 1960 when he came on the scene. And then it was just a plethora, a whole host of R&B artists that came out of Detroit. And if they didn't come out of Detroit, they came out of Philadelphia, where the songwriters were. And so that was the music that I remembered most, danced by the most, laughed by the most, and listened to the most. Yeah.
And so I want to talk a little bit about you as like a young man, a teenager. What were you thinking about in high school, kind of right before you ended up at Morgan State?
Well, I didn't spend a lot of time in high school. Actually, I was thinking about getting out. Once I got there, I was thinking about getting out and how to get out and how to get it out successfully. But my mother died when I was 15 and a half, going on 16. And by then, we had just moved out of Turner Station back into Baltimore City proper on the west side, where I was to spend pretty much the rest of my teenage years and young adult years. She contracted cancer and would talk to me periodically every night about life and death, and that I was a black man and the world was going to be a little different for me and what I had to do, what I had to expect. And then in one of those conversations, she fell into my arms and died. And so I had to drop out of school immediately thereafter. I had 3 younger sisters and didn't know how we were going to survive. I went eventually and stayed with a couple of my uncles. They eventually located with my grandmother, who had already retired. So high school for me was almost like a fleeting memory. I got through the 10th grade and it was time for me to get out. And so I started trying to figure out ways to earn money. And I shined shoes, I carried groceries. I did anything you could find a way to get a few dollars for that was legal, because I later did some things that were not so legal. But, I was able to send money to my grandmother, and she, with her fixed income, was able to take care of my sisters, and I did that for years. And, after a while, I just got exhausted because everybody else had a junior prom and a senior prom. I had neither. Everybody else was having a dating life, and all I had was a work life. And everybody else had a family that they could still go home to, even in high school, and get a warm meal and that and the other. And I was pretty much on my own, living in a 6-by-9 room for the next 8 years, I think. So high school was a fleeting memory. I had a good time. I had great friends, and ultimately, they meaning my graduating class, made me a honorary member of that class because I never graduated, and I had to, because I was out of school, I had to go back and find a way to get a GED certificate. That took a couple of years at night after I worked all day long. So I actually still have some friends from high school, if you can believe that, after all these years, that I still bump into or make sure I reach out to. So high school for me probably, well, without a doubt, was not what high school was or is to other kids. I had a different reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm curious about like what that experience taught you about yourself.
It made me realize how short life was, number one. Because when you lose your mother, you you feel like you are a fetus that somebody just disconnected from the umbilical cord, and you're just floating in space, and you don't know who's going to come along to give you the direction and the information and the lessons that you need. So, yeah, I was a little disconnected, but I learned that life is short. And I learned also that you have to fight for what you believe in. My mother was very, very good at instilling in me belief in myself, that in order for anybody to believe you, they wouldn't be able to do it if they couldn't see that you believed yourself and believed in yourself. I also learned that it's not how you start in life that counts, it's how you finish. These were some of my early lessons that didn't make a lot of sense when she was still alive, telling me that every night, but made a lot of sense every year thereafter. And I learned that faith really was not anything by itself. It had value when it was tested, because anybody could say they had faith, but when you've really been tested, that's when you know that you do. So my mother was like a Catholic, very much a Catholic. So there was always some sort of religious lesson of the week outside of what we read in the Bible. She found a way to make it real. So those are some of the things that I can think about that I remember.
Yeah. And so you talk about how your mother always talked about standing up for what you believe in and fighting for what you believe to be right. And we see that you carried that into your time at Morgan State. I'm wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about what it was like when you got there. What were students talking about on campus?
Probably what they're talking about today.
Okay.
Not in the same exact terms, but what was important to them is what they talked about then, and I'm sure what's important to students now, they talk about. Those are great years, and being a student was great because very little responsibility, so I had a good time. But when I got to Morgan, I was already working for James Brown, a.k.a. the Godfather of Soul. In my neighborhood, there were a couple of disc jockeys that were on a station called WWIN. And one was a young guy named Sam Beasley, who's still alive, and another one was Champ Hagens, who's no longer with us. They were the weekend jocks, but what made them special is they were almost like the teenage jocks, okay? Radio was very different in those days. It was personality radio. You know, if you didn't have a personality and one that you hammered out that was exclusively yours, people didn't find any reason to listen to you whatsoever. And nobody wanted to hire you because they wanted people who would attract people to their station. And so in those days, I kind of hung around WWIN radio. This was before I got to Morgan. And I was the gopher, which I didn't mind because I liked radio. I loved music, and I loved communicating. And so, I would go for this, go for that, go for this, go get somebody a sandwich, go get somebody a newspaper. You didn't earn anything, but you earned the endearment of the people at the station, the jocks, especially on the night shift where nobody even wanted to be a gopher. And then I would do other things like sit and work the dedication line. People would call in, request music, and then that it be dedicated in a certain way. And I did that over and over and over again. And in those days, were people who really were personalities. A guy named Sir Johnny O, who did a show as if he were knighted by the Queen of England, and he had this great production before he came on the air. And a guy named Rockin' Robin, who used the song Rockin' Robin as his theme. It was a medley, and people just sang it, and you'd wait for them to come on the air. So somebody would work 6 to 10 in the morning, then somebody 10 to 2, and then somebody else 2 to 6, and then 6 to 10, and then it was the graveyard shift after that. But it was all personality radio. That's what black radio was like in those days. And it wasn't just that way in Baltimore, it was that way in New York, in DC, everywhere. So I kind of got bitten by the bug then. And one day there was somebody who couldn't get to work. And the general manager of the station told me to go on. It was a 6 to 10 shift. He said, now don't you say anything. Just go on and play the voice of the person who would be on. They had a lot of drops in there. So I'm in there running the music, but what they heard was the voice of the person whose shift that was. But it gave me a chance to learn the boards. In those days, everything was the boards. How to pot up, how to pot down, how to fade out, how to work 3 turntables. So by the time I got to Morgan, I knew what I wanted to do in terms of communication. I wanted to make sure I'd have a chance to bring about a station there. Now, Howard University had gotten their station a couple of years earlier. There was always a great competition between Howard and Morgan, and it still goes on. And so for those of us in Baltimore, it was like, oh, no. We have to have our own station. And we didn't know how we were going to do it. And I think I was a junior at the time. I went back to the people who I knew, asked them what did they think. They said, well, you got to get a license. You just can't go on the air. And I said, okay. And then he said, you've got to have equipment. You just can't have a license. And I said, okay. And then he said, you've got to have a way to make money. You just can't wing it. But Debaye Sababu, who is the lady here, who is the AME minister now, and myself, and a guy named Tipper Burton, and the late Al Stewart, who became the first general manager of the station, started figuring out how we were going to do it. And we plotted and planned for almost 2 years. Fortunately, Andrew Billingsley, who was president of the university, aside from thinking that we were all crazy, said, yeah, go do what you want to do and come back to me when you're ready to talk about it. And he knew we had no money, no equipment, no anything. But he said, go do it. And we found a way to start doing it. And so we contacted local stations to find out if anybody would donate used equipment, which several did. We had to find a way to build an antenna, so we did some fundraisers and stuff like that until we got enough money to build a tower, It was a short tower. It only went up like 50 feet initially, and it sat in the swamps behind the field house on campus. And so every time, this is fast forwarding, every time it rained, it was short out, the station would go off the air. Those were some tough days. But we did everything that we had to do, and then we had to get a license. So I remember putting together a proposal for the Federal Communications Commission. And, stations on this side of the Mississippi all started with a W, and stations on the other side all started with a K. So KNBC, K this, that, and the other. And on this side, W, WIN, WEBB. And we applied and requested call letters. rather than have them just given to us, which was kind of bold because I guess the people at the FCC, they must be crazy. Nobody's ever requesting call letters of a certain type. But I requested WEAA, and as you know, it stands for We Educate African Americans. It was a kind of revolutionary set of call letters with its meaning 50 years ago because people still were not saying African Americans. You know, as archaic as that sounds, there were a lot of people who just did not see themselves as African Americans. They still saw themselves as black on their strongest day and a Negro on their weakest day. But Stokely Carmichael and James Brown and the others with Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, it started to change. So the fact that we said we educate African Americans, they at the FCC probably just said, they don't know what they're talking about. We'll give them a license. And they gave us a license. It was a daytimer. When we first came on the air with a daytime license, you could come on at the break of dawn, which was usually at about 5:55 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And then you had to go off the air when the sun set. So as you imagine, winter was like on the air at 6, off of the air at 5. And we were that way for, I think, about 6, 7 months. And then we finally got the ability to be a 24-hour station. And I think we were operating on 50,000 watts, I don't remember. So you ask these questions and I go off on a tangent because I haven't talked about this stuff in years.
Yeah. No, I want to talk a little bit about something that you said in this article called The Birth of the Radio Station, WEAA-FM, out of Morgan Magazine in 1977. And you were talking about, I think you said you want to, quote, revolutionize the listening habits of Black people. Can you just talk a little bit about those people that were in the room at the very beginning? What was your intention broadly with the station when it came to programming and how you wanted it to be received by the community?
Well, I wanted it to be different. I didn't want it to be all personality radio, which I was coming out of. I didn't want it to be stiff and pre-programmed. And I didn't want it to be just another radio station. It was the only vehicle we had for communications. And my point was you cannot rely on white stations to tell you information about who you are, what you need, and where you're going. And they're not going to also broadcast or talk about your history or cultural similarities or differences or your community unless somebody got shot. So we had to, and me, I thought more than anything else, be the voice of the community. And the community was a broad community. And, you know, we had Afro, Black, Caribbean, you name it. For me, the community was more than just something simple. So I wanted a station that would, in fact, do that. Now, you got to remember, James Brown fired me about at least a dozen times in the years that I was working with him because he just didn't like all this revolutionary stuff at the moment. He needed to make money, you know, and making money was getting people to listen in and have good ratings. And Mr. Brown was funny because he knew in his heart of hearts, he knew that I was right, that this was a very powerful vehicle. And he had this station in Baltimore, which was WEBB, and another one down south, and I just can't remember the call letters to it. But he was an interesting person. And I tell you the story about being fired because it taught me, it helped me to realize that I knew I was right. If I ever got near a station and could program it, I was going to do some other stuff with it. But looking back on it, by the way, every time he fired me, he hired me back a week to 10 days later because he wanted me to make sure I graduated from school. He said that more than anything else was what's important to him. And I made $2 an hour and I worked 40 hours a week. But by the time I got to Morgan, I had an appreciation about why this vehicle was so important and so strong and what it could do and what it could change. One side note about James Brown. Years after that, and I got elected, I was in the Congress, because all he ever wanted me to do was go to college, right? He was so proud. He came here to the Congress one day and said he had to meet with me, he had to meet me. And they said, no, you're going to go over here, you're going to meet the speaker, you're going to do this, you're going to do... He said, and you don't understand, I need to see him, because I helped to make him, and which nobody knew at the time. And I remember he came into the office. I think Al Sharpton was with him at the time. And first thing we did was hug and embrace. And I remember him, I could just feel him welling up. And he just started crying right there in front of me. And he wasn't trying to hide it or anything. It's just that he said he saw through me what he wanted in so many ways to happen in our communities. And that was to create somebody and something that would be different, that would take where his generation left off and take it to a higher level. So I will always treasure James Brown. He was almost like a second father. And Sharpton will say the same thing. He was like a second father to him. But that's an aside again. You see, there are all these little avenues that go off of the main boulevard. I just knew we had a tool and that it had to be used the right way. And for me, the right way was maximizing the flow of information to help people. So we were very creative in those days. We had a show that was the Caribbean Affair, which, you weren't going to hear any Caribbean music on the air in those days unless you tuned into us. We had Two-Way Talk, which is a nightly talk show. Actually, I did that for 5 years myself as the host. This was before talk radio. Anybody was doing talk radio. Now, everybody does it because it's old hat. We did Gospel Grace, which was a show dedicated not just to gospel music, but to the evolution of the black church and gospel music. We did a show that was aimed at teenagers. There's a lot of specialized programming. Now, if you look at the programming chart, it's like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to listen to because they've got all these different things. But we did it, and we created our own news department. And even though we were an NPR affiliate, after the NPR news went off, we did our take on the news. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of talk, a lot of emphasis. But I wanted something that was so different and touched so many aspects of our community that people eventually would realize they had to listen. And that's actually what happened. The station became extremely popular. And it didn't take a long time for that to happen. And those are my thoughts about what I wanted.
Yeah. Is there a moment that you remember where you realized, it's working?
Oh, yeah. When people wanted to take it over, that's when I said, oh, this is a little different. We must have some value. How can I say this? Some people in the administration said, oh, no, we've got to control this, because they didn't want to upset lawmakers in Annapolis, because we're a state university and get a lot of our money from the state. And then there were revolutionary aspects within the faculty that wanted it, because they said, oh, we can really be revolutionary and do some things with it. And then there were stations in the community that were really bad-mouthing us. And they didn't do it directly, but they had a whole army of people who just bad-mouthed the station. We couldn't get any good press in the newspapers. I just knew everybody realized that there was value there then. And what it caused all of us to do who were at the station was just to lock arms and to almost swear we were never going to fold and cave into anything other than what we were and what we always hoped to be. And there were a lot of good people that came through that station, a lot of jocks, a lot of persons who had good expertise, who wanted it to succeed, who gave willingly of themselves, who didn't take a salary because we didn't have any money. This was like all volunteer, and it worked. It worked.
What was the station's role in student protest that was happening on campus?
We were an agitator. That's the best way to put it. We believed, because we were just barely students ourselves. I mean, I graduated in '76, so I'd been out of school for a year on campus. We just believed that the student voice had to be heard, and we knew it was not going to be heard anywhere else except on WEAA, because there was always an effort, as there still is today, to kind of stymie student protest. But we gave students the voice, the vehicle, and the venue to be able to talk to other students, because at the end of the day, this really was a student station. That's how we started it, and that's how we wanted to maintain it. We wanted to make sure it provided a training vehicle for students, but also a voice. And in those early days, it definitely provided a voice. I was in a unique position because I would ultimately end up being a member of the Board of Regents at the university. And all those student voices that we gave a platform to, I don't want to say rioted, that's the wrong word. There was a rebellion. And students wanted things a certain way. They wanted Annapolis to respond to them. They wanted people to know that they wanted fairness, justice, fair play, and equal access, all the things that most students took for granted we had to fight for, and they had to fight for. So I relished that role because I felt like we had done something then. There was no voice for students to communicate on before then. And Kathy Hughes, to her credit, Kathy was on the air over at WOLB, and I'm trying to think of who my counterpart was at WHUR. Just cannot think of her name right now. They were very, very, very helpful on that end. Both Kathy as an entrepreneur and the people at WHUR as co-partners in terms of being another HBCU with a station. They gave us strength and support, and we tried to do the same back whenever we could. So there was a camaraderie there, unspoken in many respects, but you could feel this fabric of voices growing, and they were growing as a result of these radio stations.
Yeah. And I want to talk about that because, with this project, we obviously visit so many different stations and get to talk to people from across time that have been involved with those stations. And there is this ecosystem of HBCU radio, but all of the stations are incredibly unique to themselves, to their institutions, to their communities. Can you talk about Morgan State and WEAA and what makes it special in this landscape?
It's independence. That's the most important thing. Its independence makes it special. It makes it valuable, and it makes it very personal for a lot of people, because no matter what they may hear on the station or no matter how they may feel about things, they know it's an independent voice. We're not bought. Well, I'm still saying we. They're not bought by anybody, and that's special because you could tune in and hear almost anything at any time, and you would know that it was unfiltered. So for Morgan, I think, and this is probably the case for several other HBCU stations, the independence just it's a breath of fresh air in a society where everything is almost controlled 24 hours a day.
Yeah. And so, kind of in the interest of time, because I know we could spend forever talking about what was happening, tell me what you took out of your experience at WEAA and how that, as kind of a learning lab, went to influence your political career and everything that you've done since.
Well, I was a part of the creation of something that I didn't know was creating something in me. And when I saw how all of us got together with an idea, before we had a studio, a microphone, call letters, or anything else, there was a belief that we could do something different for the community and for our people that would bring about change. Maybe I've always been about change, I don't know, but there was something about that that ultimately brought about that change in me, because the more the station was in the forefront of issues, and the more the station fought to bring about fairness and justice and equality, and the more the station gave birth to other voices, I just felt something growing in me that said I needed to do the same thing, and didn't know what that was. And then it just hit me one day. I needed to change the government if I could. The station had done as much as it could to do that as a vehicle and a vessel, but something in me was saying it's time for you to try to do that yourself. The station is fine, and you should try something else. And so I got together with about 10 of my friends who I graduated with. This was 2 years after WEAA, maybe 3. And I decided I was going to run for city council in Baltimore. And what irked me was the fact that there was a councilman there by the name of Emerson Julian, who was, I'm sure, a very good and decent man. But he just, in my opinion, didn't take the right position on real everyday issues. He was a physician by training. And so the city council job was, I guess, maybe something to do. And he had a great family. And I just believed that I should try to run, to take the voice that we had, the vehicle that we had given to students that created this voice in me, and to try to let it grow out of me to see if anything would happen. And I was always influenced by the leaders of the time. I mean, Dr. King, and the way my mother worshiped him, and listening to him at nights on an old creaky radio, because they didn't want to put him on TV live in those days for anything. He didn't get on live really until the March on Washington. But that kind of was growing a voice in me. And Muhammad Ali, who I don't want to say I worshiped him, but I certainly did admire him. And he and I became good friends later on in life. But it was being daring enough, because Dr. King, in my opinion, was daring, and Muhammad Ali was daring. It was those kind of persons that caught my attention. And so, not knowing what I was going to do, I didn't have any money. Nobody took me seriously. I was a voice on a radio station. I got together with those 10 people, and we spent a year trying to raise money. We raised about $11,000 to run a full campaign on. But it was something about daring and being different. I left the station one day and went down to City Hall. It was a Monday. The city council used to meet at 5 o'clock. And I remember going onto the floor of the council, pushing past the guard. And I went to Councilman Emerson Julian's seat, and I sat in it. And everybody just stopped and looked at me like, who are you and what are you doing here on the floor? And guards, come get this guy. And I sat there and I stood up and I turned around and pointed to everybody on the city council that was there. And I said, I came here to claim this seat. I am so-and-so and so-and-so. Of course, they didn't know. I said, but I'm here to make a difference, and I will win. Now, they should have had me arrested, quite frankly, because I had violated the rules of the council, but that was unrehearsed. I don't know where it came from. Maybe it was a little bit of Muhammad Ali, a little bit of Dr. King, but I really believed that. And so a year later, I got elected, but I only got elected by 3 votes, which is still the closest election in the state of Maryland. It was a hard-fought election. It was very, very ugly. But I weathered the storm and got sworn in December 1979. Stayed at WEAA for a few more years to help make sure that it was going the way we all originally wanted it to go. And then in January of '85, I stepped down and stepped away because the next month I got sworn in as a member of Congress.
And so my last question, all of that being said, considering everything that we've talked about today, and based on what I've told you about this project and our goals, why is it important to preserve the history of HBCU radio stations?
Because if we don't tell our story, nobody will tell it. And stations at HBCUs continually tell that story over and over and over again. And there is value in being deliberately redundant, particularly now when we consider where we are. I always quote a speech given by Abraham Lincoln in 1848 when he, as a young man, addressed his countrymen and he said to them, when you have succeeded in dehumanizing the Negro, when you have put him down and made it but for him to be but as the beast of the field, when you have extinguished his soul in this world and placed him where the ray of hope is blown out, are you quite sure that the demon you have roused will not turn one day and rend you? And he goes on and he concludes that speech by saying that our strength is not in our armies, our navy, or anything that we have contrived. He said, our strength is in the love of liberty, which has planted itself deep in the souls of all men everywhere. And he admonished, destroy that spirit, and you would have planted the seeds of despotism at your own doorstep, and then be subject to the first cunning tyrant who rises among you. That tyrant is Donald Trump. He has risen among us, and he's done that because he believed that he had a story to tell that was more powerful. He had one, but his is all centered around hope. We tell our story in a different way. We tell it through love and through tears and sacrifice. And I just really, really believe that that speech was foreshadowing what this country has never seen before, a cunning tyrant who rose among us to do away with civil liberties, to do away with the guarantees that so many people have lived and died for. And that's why we need stations at HBCUs who are not bought by anybody, who are not directed by anybody, but who maintain their independence to tell our story over and over and over again. I know if some people would have their way, they would just wipe those stations out, but they can't, and they won't. And that's the sort of thing that we need going forward, knowing that if we're not here, somebody will be there behind the microphones telling the truth and telling our story.